without further ado, Dr. Newport, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, you are very welcome.
People who aren't familiar with your work, I'd just
Mhm.
like to introduce you to the audience, and I hope I haven't missed anything here. You are a medical doctor who's board
Right.
certified in pediatric and neonatology. I had to try
Correct.
and rehearse that word. And you're also the founding medical director of 2 newborn intensive care units. And
Mhm.
in 2008, you are sort of famous and renowned for your intervention of exogenous ketone and a ketogenic diet on your late husband Steve and his
Yeah.
battle with Alzheimer's.
Yes.
You've also written 4 books with a tentative 5th on the way,
Mhm.
and really excited to have you here.
Yeah, it's really nice for you to have me here, Ben. Really great to meet you.
Well, the feeling's mutual. So, just to start with your in 2008, what
Mhm.
that very sad diagnosis of your husband then with sort of early onset Alzheimer's. What led
Correct.
you to take matters into your own hands and
Mhm. Mhm.
intervene with the ketogenic diet and exogenous ketones as well?
Yeah. Yeah. So I was always keeping my eye open for new research, new drugs, and basically in our area, we had 2 new clinical trials for Alzheimer's come along, and these were both drugs that remove plaques from the brain and help prevent buildup of further plaques, which is the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. These beta amyloid plaques in the brain. Steve was he had been an accountant. He had deteriorated quite a lot from 2004 when he was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's to 2008. And he was, there's 7 stages of Alzheimer's, and he was kind of between the 5th and 6th stage. He was quite far along in the process already, and going downhill fairly quickly. So in May of 2008, there were 2 new clinical trials that became available in our area. And I was able to set up appointments at 2 different centers for testing, for these 2 different drugs 2 days in a row, which was fortuitous because of what happened. And the night before the first screening, I got online. I was looking for the risk and benefits of these 2 drugs. And I happened on a press release about a medical food that was going to come out in about a year. And they had done clinical trials. And the first pilot study of 20 people, in which they took either this AC1202 or a placebo on one day, and 2 weeks later, they took the opposite. They found that 9 out of 20 people had improvement in their memory and cognitive testing scores, which you never hear with Alzheimer's drugs, that people actually improve with regard to memory and cognition. So I thought, what is it? It didn't really explain much about what it was. So I found their patent application, and I learned that it was just an MCT oil, medium chain triglyceride oil called C8. And I was familiar with MCT oil because, as a neonatologist, which is a newborn specialist, I worked in newborn intensive care units. We would add MCT oil to the feedings of our tiniest preemies, babies that were under a kilo birth weight. And they would get some of this with each feeding, and they would gain weight. They'd go home faster. They absorbed it really well. And it was also in intravenous lipids that we gave to these babies who couldn't eat, when they were in the intensive care unit.
Well,
So I knew what CT oil was.
is that because so you had exposure to it with your work with
Mhm,
nipple babies? Is that
mhm.
my thing? Is there's a portion of breast milk which is made up
Yes.
of the deal? Is that right?
Yeah. About somewhere between 10 and 17% of the fats in human breast milk are medium chain triglycerides.
Wow.
So, adding this MCT provides these medium chain triglycerides that other oils, like soybean, olive, just the oils people usually use have no medium chain triglycerides in it, but breast milk does, and milk fat does too. Other milk, from cows, goats, horse, sheep
Mm.
have MCTs. So, part of the reason to add the MCT is to provide these missing fatty acids, to these babies while they can't receive breast milk. Um, and, then infant formula manufacturers started actually adding it to all infant formulas. in the form of MCT directly, MCT oil and or coconut oil. And this was in the mid 1980s that they started doing this. If you look on the labels now, you'll still see coconut oil on virtually every infant formula, commercial infant formula. Sometimes palm kernel oil, which has a similar profile, a little bit less of the medium chains, but still a significant amount of it. So sometimes palm kernel oil. And so, I was kind of intrigued. Okay, this is MCT oil. I know what this is. I wasn't sure if it was available just in hospitals or not. But the idea behind it has to do with a problem that happens in Alzheimer's brain 10 to 20 years, maybe even longer before a person even has symptoms. There is a problem of insulin resistance in the brain and some other deficiencies in certain glucose transporters and things like that decrease the uptake of glucose into the brain and into brain cells. And this it has been documented on they call it an FDG PET. It's a glucose uptake PET scan. They've known this since the 1980s that there's this problem with glucose uptake in the brain. So every cell needs fuel. And if you're on a typical diet, glucose is the predominant fuel, that we use for our brain and other organs. So on a typical American diet, maybe a typical UK diet, I don't know, tends to be higher in carb. We've been told to eat low-fat diet for a long time. And so an alternative fuel to glucose for the brain are ketones. And this happens if you're eating a low-carb, higher-fat diet, you can be in ketosis. But, it was studied back in the 1960s when they were trying to understand starvation and how the brain survives long periods of starvation. Dr. George Cahill Jr., they published studies showing that during prolonged starvation that you start breaking down fat. Most organs in the body can use fatty acids from the fat. And however, it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier very well. So these fatty acids don't get to the brain very well. So some of those are converted to ketones in the liver. And then ketones are very tiny molecules. They're actually smaller than a glucose molecule. And they cross the blood-brain barrier. They're taken up by brain cells. They don't require insulin like glucose does require insulin either directly or indirectly to get into the brain and to get into brain cells. Ketones don't. So this problem, with Alzheimer's of insulin resistance and getting glucose into the brain and brain cells can be bypassed by providing ketones as a fuel. So the cool thing about medium chain triglycerides is when you consume them, no matter what you eat, some of that will be converted to ketones. So this was really a brilliant idea that Dr. Samuel Henderson had. This was around 2000 that he filed a patent application for using MCT oil to provide ketones, a level of ketosis that he thought might help improve memory and cognition in people with Alzheimer's. So this first pilot study they did was in 2004, which was the year my husband was diagnosed. It was in an obscure journal. I didn't see it, never heard a thing about it. And then their second study, 152 people bore out the findings. Nearly half of the people who took it for at 45 days, 90 days, and some extended to 6 months, almost half of them had cognitive improvement. And it was sustained over time as well. Some of them were back to baseline after 6 months, but they had gained in between. So they had not declined, below where they started out, even at 6 months. So I thought, wow, this is really something. And in the patent application, they mentioned that it was extracted from coconut oil or palm kernel oil. And I didn't know that MCT oil was already available online. I thought maybe this was something that you could get in a hospital, perhaps, but I knew I could get coconut oil. So anyway, I'm reading about all of this. It's about 1 a.m. in the morning. Steve scheduled my husband for his first screening about an hour away at 9 a.m. So I had to kind of couldn't do a thing about it. Couldn't get anything that had coconut oil or MCT oil in it. And so we went for the screening, and he needed to get at least 16 points on a 30-point test called the mini mental status exam. And he didn't. He scored only 14 points, and he needed 16 to qualify. So we were really disappointed. The doctor asked him to draw a clock, the clock test. And I can try to show you what his clock looked like. So if you can imagine that is supposed to be a clock. So a few little circles and a few numbers,
Yeah.
very disorganized. And the doctor told me he's on the verge of severe Alzheimer's. And I knew that, but to see it visually was really profoundly disturbing and distressing. So on the way home, I thought I'm going to pick up some coconut oil. I'm going to learn as much as I can about this because we had a screening the next day. I mean, we were determined to get him into a clinical trial. This was our hope. We had been holding out, hoping that he would get into a clinical trial with a drug that would improve, his outcome and maybe even cure his disease. That's what we've been promised for years and years by the Alzheimer's Association. So we got coconut oil. When we got home, I kind of refreshed my memory about which fatty acids were the medium chain fatty acids. I was able to get a fatty acid composition from a USDA website of coconut oil and figure out how much medium chain triglycerides were in coconut oil. So if you consider the fatty acids called C6 to C12, meaning they have 6 to 12 carbons in a chain that forms the skeleton, basically of the fatty acid, that it was 60% of the coconut oil. So they were giving 20 grams in the long-term study of MCT oil, and that converted to 35 grams of coconut oil. So the next day, I thought, since his screening was at 1 p.m, that I would give him coconut oil at breakfast. And that turned out to be good too, because it gave several hours for him to reach a peak level of ketones from the coconut oil. But so we mix it into oatmeal. In the US at room temperature, coconut oil tends to be kind of semi-solid, a little bit like butter or margarine, just the consistency of it. And about 4 hours later, we went to a different location, different town for this screening. They used the same test, the mini mental status exam, and he gained 4 points from the day before, and he qualified for the study. And a 4-point gain from one day to the next is really quite profound. But I wasn't really sure. Did we just get lucky? Was it prayers answered? Or was it really this thing? And so I decided, well, we're going to start doing this every day. And one of the things that I learned in the patent application is that when you consume MCT oil, the level of ketones peaks at about an hour and a half and is back to baseline at about 3 hours in the study that they had done. So I thought, wait a minute, the brain needs ketones. It's going to need fuel 24/7. What about the other 21 hours? So right away, I got cookbooks and recipes to try to add it to each of his meals. I thought, why not add it 3 times a day and try to keep ketones going continuously? Excuse me. So that's what we did. So the very next day, I kept giving him the 35 grams at breakfast, and then I would add it at other meals.
How much is 35 grams? How many sort of tablespoons?
Okay, so
Just
that's a little bit over 2 tablespoons. It's 7 level teaspoons.
okay. So not an unreasonable amount. Not something.
Not an unreasonable amount. 35 mLs roughly, too. It would be 35 mLs for people that are familiar with that. So not a terrible, it's more than most people would usually eat, but it wasn't a terrible amount. And I took it too. I have Alzheimer's on both sides of my family, very strong on the maternal side of my family. And I thought if this could help somebody who already has Alzheimer's, maybe it could help prevent it. So I started right away using this for prevention for myself. So everything I cooked, with coconut oil, and, at breakfast, I did that too. And I still do.
Wow.
We're now 16 years later, and I still do that. So every day we saw improvements. He's had the increase in his score the first day. And, within a few days, he told me, he said he felt like a light bulb came on in his brain the day he started the coconut oil, and it lifted his spirits. I mean, he had a slow, stiff gait. He started walking faster. He started joking and whistling again and finishing sentences again. And he had tremors. He had a tremor in his jaw when he would talk. And that stopped almost right away. I didn't really ever see that again. He had a hand tremor when he would eat. His hand would shake when he was trying to get the food to his mouth. And he would sometimes have that in the morning, but after the coconut oil, 20 or 30 minutes later, that was gone. And we wouldn't see it usually for the rest of the day. So he was in better spirits. His mood was much better. He had been even, I mean, so severely depressed and even suicidal, because he was well aware of what he had been able to do, what he couldn't do, and that he had Alzheimer's. He knew that. Sorry. Some
Yeah.
people are in denial. Yeah. Some people are in denial about that. But he knew it, and he wasn't in denial. He was devastated, what he wasn't able to do anymore. I mean, he was an accountant. He was on a computer all day. He couldn't even turn a computer on, much less use a mouse or figure out how to do a thing on a computer at that point, which was really sad. So, by a fourth or fifth day, we're like, something has changed here for the better. Oh my gosh, this is a big deal. This works. The scientific basis is holding up, and it was supported by the studies that had already been done, that this was possible. Even the pilot study, people
Wow.
improved with the very first dose. So we just kept it going. And that's, basically how I got involved in at like 2 weeks
Yeah.
after he had another clock drawing.
Okay.
And you can
That,
see that looks like, you could say, okay, that looks like a clock.
well, yeah. For those,
Circle.
the difference between the first drawings and the one we're seeing now, which is 2 weeks after, is
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
really.
And then it was about a month after.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah. And he told
Nice.
me the lines. I thought, what are all these lines? What did you say?
Well, I was going to mention that. I was going to say that I can see the lines look more like clock-like in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. And he explained, I thought they were hands of the clock. I thought, oh my gosh, he's putting all these hands of the clock. He said, no, the lines, he was trying to line the numbers up across from each other.
Oh right. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So that's why he was drawing the lines. He was trying to line them up so that they would be a neat clock,
So
Yeah. Yeah.
those two
So,
weeks caught
yeah.
your I guess the next 16 years, as you said.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So
So things improved so drastically. I'm like, oh my God, I've got like this big secret. This medical food's not coming out for a year at least, you know. Nobody's talking about it. Had never heard anything about it. Hadn't heard about this problem of glucose uptake and insulin resistance. These are all new to me. And somehow I've got to tell, at that time, they were saying there were 35 million people in the world with dementia, Alzheimer's being the most common type. And I'm like, I've got a lot of people that I need to tell about this. And I
definitely.
started talking with Dr. Richard Veach at the NIH. He was considered to be the world expert on ketones at the time. I found his telephone number in Wikipedia, of all places. I called the number and he answered himself. I was just blown away. And I had so many questions, and he answered all my questions. He told me about a ketone ester that he had been working on since the 1990s, that would get ketone levels much higher than you could get with MCT oil and coconut oil. I asked him about coconut oil. Do you think it is possible that somebody with Alzheimer's could improve when taking coconut oil? He said, no, 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 the levels would never be high enough. I didn't really tell him right away what we were doing, but when the clock at 2 weeks, when Steve drew that, I faxed the first clock, the second clock, to him, and he was blown away. He called me. He said, "Well, this is unexpected." And he put me in touch with several other ketone researchers, Dr. Cahill, who had done the starvation studies in the 1960s. I mean, these men were all up in age. Dr. Theodore Van Italy, he was with the group that had, and Dr. Sammy Hashem, the two of them were in the group that had discovered that MCTs are converted to ketones in the liver, medium chain triglycerides. So these were incredible conversations that I got to have, with these brilliant men, who had been doing ketone research. They'd written hypothesis papers about this in the early 2000s. And now I got to spend hours talking to these men. They were so excited. They were so excited because they had theorized that this would help people with Alzheimer's, but this was the first time they had heard of it, a person, who had improved, and with something like coconut oil.
It's really profound. Just you mentioned George Cahill. Could you let the listeners know how long those? You wouldn't be able to do these experiments now, I don't think. But how long were those experiments of starvation?
Yeah. So his first patient was a lady. She was a nurse. She was very overweight, and she wanted to lose weight. So they brought her into their metabolic ward, which is how they studied things like that in those days. They put catheters like into blood vessels around her liver and her brain, so that they could test the blood. And then they fasted her for, I believe it was 41 days. And they justified it. Yeah. They put her, she had IV fluids and vitamins, and salt was all they gave her. And she, lost a tremendous amount of weight. But they were able to study what happened with the fuels, what was fueling her brain. And they found that glucose levels dropped down fairly quickly in the blood, within, like 24 to 48 hours. Glucose stores were fairly depleted. So glucose was providing much less of the fuel, but they found that fatty acids had increased in the blood, and that the two ketones that they could study in the blood, acetoacetate and especially beta hydroxybutyrate, had climbed. They started climbing around the 2-day mark, and around somewhere between 10 and 20 days, it kind of leveled off at a very high level of beta hydroxybutyrate. Acetoacetate was about 20-25% of the beta hydroxybutyrate, and acetoacetate converts to beta hydroxybutyrate. That's what it usually does. It also converts to acetone, which you mostly exhale, and that one's really hard to measure in blood. It's very volatile, so they don't measure it much, and I wish they would, because the levels of that can be quite high in the blood, and I think it plays a role that we just don't know what it is yet. So I'm hoping that acetone will get studied, and the effects of acetone and what impact that could have in the brain. So very interesting study.
I remember I heard about it from Dr. Dominic D'Agostino, mentioned it in the podcast. I want to go read about this. And fascinating. You can even fast for 41 days.
Right.
Really, it shows an extreme case of your body has this wonderful mechanism of metabolic flexibility, right? You've got glucose most of the time for most people in the world. However, there's this amazing system of metabolizing or using ketones, metabolizing fat for energy. So my question for you, Dr. Newport, is just understanding how the brain uses energy. You have glucose or you have ketones. Which does it prefer?
Okay, well, Dr. Stephen Cunnane in Canada has done some really interesting studies to kind of help sort that out. And he does ketone and glucose PET scans. He was the first in the world to do these, and there are a couple of other centers doing them now. But he studied more than 300 adults of all ages to try to sort all of this out. And one of the early studies that they did were people who were on a standard, typical higher carbohydrate diet, and then a ketogenic diet. I believe they were on the ketogenic diet for 6 weeks. And then they did these PET scans, before and after. And what they showed was that on a ketogenic diet, that ketone levels in the brain, ketone uptake in the brain greatly increased, and glucose uptake decreased. especially in certain areas. It was more prominent in certain areas. There were certain areas of the brain that still took up glucose very well. But what they found was that when glucose and ketones are both available, that certain areas of the brain prefer to take up ketones.
Wow.
So
Okay.
that's able to show with the study. So
And
apparently it's not every area of the brain, but certain areas of the brain prefer to take up ketones. And even the white matter in the brain, they've been able to document that even just taking MCT oil would increase ketone uptake in the brain and into white matter of the brain, not just gray matter, but white matter, which are the nerve fibers, that are covered, they're insulated with myelin, that become, in part of the spinal cord, in the brain, parts of the brain where the brain tracts are. And they were able to correlate in one of their studies of MCT oil. It's called processing speed, how quickly you can retrieve memories, basically, that this correlated with a really specific network in the white matter that had increased uptake of ketones. They were able to document this improvement in processing speed correlated with ketone uptake in this network in the brain.
wow.
Um, so very interesting. It's the dorsal attention network, I think it's called.
Okay. Well, anecdotally, when I'm in ketosis and have taken exogenous ketones, I find
Mhm.
recall of words and what I want to be able to say
Mhm.
like night and day. I'm much more articulate. I mean, not very articulate as it is, but I'm better with my words when I'm in that
Yeah.
state. So interesting mechanism. So with regards to demands, the brain demands fuel, and if I understand correctly, the
Mhm.
mechanism proposed for the ketogenic therapy
Mhm.
and ketones for Alzheimer's is there's an impaired glucose uptake in the brain. So there has to be another source of energy, otherwise there's no energy. And this
Mhm.
energy, ketones, and the brain uses them very effectively. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
And Dr. Cunane has been able to also document with these PET scans that people with Alzheimer's disease, they confirmed that there are areas of the brain with decreased glucose uptake, substantially decreased. This happens in aging too, but ketone uptake is normal in these areas of the brain. So
Huh.
they've been able to actually document this, and which supports this whole concept of using ketones as a fuel for the brain.
Wow. And so that
Yeah.
was you had this hunch, right, with your husband, and then obviously
Mhm.
it snowballed, the research has snowballed since. So
Yeah.
specifically for Alzheimer's and cognitive um,
Mhm.
decline, what does the research show about being in a state of ketosis and exogenous ketones? The emerging literature, I guess.
Yeah, there are quite a few studies now, mostly of MCT oil. Some are ketogenic diet without any special oil. There's a group at, for example, at Wake Forest University, which is in North Carolina in the U.S., and they have also started using the ketone and glucose PET scans. So they were able to document this too, and they did a study of people with mild cognitive impairment, which precedes Alzheimer's, taking, I believe it was for 8 weeks each, a standard American Heart Association diet, which is a low fat, high carb diet, versus a Mediterranean style ketogenic diet. And they were able to document that there was increased energy supplied to the brain, and they that they didn't feel that they saw about the same difference in cognitive improvement, but there were markers of Alzheimer's disease in spinal fluid, blood, other types of markers that improved only when they were getting the ketogenic diet, which was interesting. Um, and then Cunane himself, he did a study, 65 people with mild cognitive impairment, and they got either a placebo or MCT oil. And this was a C8, C10 MCT oil, so kind of the standard MCT oil that's out there. And they were able to document that there was an increase in multiple cognitive domains and this increase in ketones and white matter, that these people improved and that they sustained the improvement. They were able to sustain the level of ketosis, by they were giving 15 mLs, which is a tablespoon of MCT oil twice a day for 6 months. And that, relatively small amount. They were given it at 2 meals, was enough to improve their cognitive testing and documented, increased ketone uptake in the brain, filling in what he calls the brain energy gap that
Hmm.
happens in people and in mild cognitive impairment, much worse than Alzheimer's disease. So, yeah, we could talk about the brain energy gap, because when he studied these 300 adults, they were people of all ages, adults, ages 20 to into their 70s at least. And he was able to show that as we age, that we develop a gap between how much energy our brain needs and how much it actually gets. And when we're in our 70s, this gap can be 7 to 9% of the energy deficit in the brain, which explains this, you know, um, age-related memory impairment that people develop, and just slowing down, cognitive decline in general, and people, in their 70s that test normal have this gap. They still will have a 7 to 9% energy gap. It's worse in mild cognitive impairment. It's about 10 or 12% gap. And Alzheimer's at the earliest stages, it's at least a 20% gap. And that just gets worse as Alzheimer's progresses. It kind of makes you think Alzheimer's is kind of on a spectrum of aging, cognitive decline relating to aging. And probably the biggest factor that triggers Alzheimer's is inflammation in the brain that really puts you on a downward spiral as far as cognitive decline. But he's been able to show that taking this 2 tablespoons a day of MCT oil fills in that brain energy gap that even people with mild cognitive impairment, have. It could fill in, 9 or 10% of this energy gap just taking 2 tablespoons a day. He told me, personally that 3 tablespoons would be even better.
That's a really
So,
lovely
yeah,
phrase. It's a supply and demand problem across mild
yeah,
cognitive impairment, and I guess optimal brain function would.
yeah.
There's no supply and demand problem, right?
Mhm.
They're balanced out. But the further down that spectrum you go, the more
Mhm.
likely you have inflammation of the brain and cognitive
Mhm.
impairment. Understood
Yeah,
correct.
inadequate energy to the brain, and
Okay.
and just yeah, the ketones can fill that in, and that was Dr. Beach's, belief too. He thought it would take much higher levels of ketones to actually penetrate, all areas of the brain and to bring about cognitive improvement. So he was really quite surprised. But there have been a number of other studies now with MCT oil too. I have on my website, I have a reference list. I have a page called Scientific Articles, and at the top of it, it's like an 8-page reference list with numerous studies that have been done. Some small, some medium size. There aren't studies yet of 2,000 or 3,000 people doing this, but there's a couple of coconut oil using coconut oil. There's one that I like a lot that was conducted in Australia, Dr. Matthew Phillips. And first he did a study with people with Parkinson's, and then he did one with Alzheimer's. And they were either on, kind of the standard low fat diet versus a ketogenic diet. And the thing about it, even though the article didn't talk about coconut oil, um, the supplementary information they provide the diets that the people were on, a recipe book that they were to use during the study. And almost every recipe in the ketogenic diet book had coconut oil in it, coconut oil or coconut milk, which is loaded with coconut oil.
Hmm.
So it was, you might call it a coconut oil study, but a ketogenic diet. Basically, it was a ketogenic diet, and the people did quite well with compared to the other diet, both for the Parkinson's study and for the Alzheimer's study.
It's really.
He's Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to ask about the exogenous ketones. I mean, there's a lovely anecdote of when Dom D'Agostino went for dinner with yourself and your lady,
Hmm. Yeah.
and your husband had tremors until he had a shot of what
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
was MCT and coconut mix. So
Right.
my question is, what would be the optimal MCT slash coconut formula
Mm,
for someone who might
okay.
have cognitive impairment or early onset Alzheimer's? Would it be coconut, MCT, or how would you think about that?
Okay. So, yeah, so I kind of did a lot of work at home, trying to figure out a good ratio, that would help my husband. We started adding, well, Dr. Veach had measured Steve's ketone levels after taking 2 doses of coconut oil one day, and the levels did increase. But then he had him take just C8 MCT oil, which is in that medical food. It was available on the shelf. Why we have to wait for a medical food is beyond me. But so his levels were a bit higher with the MCT oil. And so Dr. Veach, he tried to encourage me to forego the coconut oil and just give him MCT oil to try to maximize the ketone levels. But I thought, wait a minute, he improved very much with coconut oil. What if there is something else in it that is impacting this? Because the levels aren't very high, with coconut oil, but they're there nevertheless. But there might be something else. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to mix it. So, and the idea was, if you the levels with coconut oil peaked at about 3 hours, and we're still there after 6 or 7 hours. There were still ketones being produced. And these were blood, studies that were done. Like we had the blood drawn, and then they ran the studies at the NIH. We had to overnight, the blood samples, and um, so basically, coconut oil kind of has an extended, and this is because like C6, C8 are very ketogenic. They very rapidly convert to ketones. C10, another medium chain, takes longer to start producing ketones. C12 takes even longer, and C12 is half of the coconut oil. It's lauric acid.
Okay,
So it starts producing ketones like hours later, but it stays elevated in the blood for many hours.
right.
So I think of it as that coconut oil, because it has this fatty acid, then this converting to ketones, that it may have a more steady level of ketones that it provides. The peak level's lower, but it's more continuously available. With MCT oil, just as a reminder, it tends to peak the ketone levels at 90 minutes, and at 3 hours it's gone. So I thought, okay, if we mix the two, we can get higher levels in general and sustain it by adding the coconut oil. And the other interesting thing about coconut oil is it contains a virgin coconut oil. It contains polyphenols that are anti-inflammatory, they're antioxidant. So it has other substances in it. And I knew this at the time. I also had learned that lauric acid is highly antimicrobial. It's half of the coconut oil. It kills numerous bacteria, viruses, fungus, protozoa, spirochetes, organisms like in the mouth, dental pathogens, things that have been implicated in hundreds of studies as possible causes or contributors to Alzheimer's disease. So I thought, lauric acid might be beneficial, to him too, if there's some infection at play, with this. So I came up with a ratio to answer your question of
Right.
4 parts MCT to 3 parts coconut oil. So this would be, so, basically the mixture, you would have like 4 ounces of MCT oil to 3 ounces of coconut oil.
Okay,
And so that would be, let's see, 4 ounces, 120 mLs to about 90 mLs of coconut oil.
right.
And so a
Yes.
4-to-3 ratio,
And
basically.
with that formula, you have the immediate spike of the MCT, which I
Mhm. Yeah.
can if I butcher this, but for the listener who's sort of new to exogenous
Mhm.
ketone and um, the
Yeah.
whole world of ketosis, an MCT would be something like the equivalent of a dextrose tablet that's absorbed by the body very rapidly, but then goes. And a coconut oil would be a slower release, almost like a
Right.
slow carb equivalent of this kind of fat. Is
Yeah.
that because of
Seen
the
it.
of the molecules? So the shorter the chain, the faster it gets absorbed, and the longer the slower. Oh, okay,
Exactly.
that's
Yeah.
really that's really interesting. So, where do ketone salts come into this?
So ketone salts came along in 2016, so 8 years after my husband improved. And he never had the benefit. He died. He passed away, right at the beginning of 2016. Um, and the ketone salts were just getting released right at that time on the market in the US. And Dominic D'Agostino, who you mentioned, he was really the one who studied these intensively and helped develop what became the ketone salts products in the US. And I know they're available in the UK and certain countries in Europe and Asia, Australia, places like that, Canada now. But in the beginning, they were just available in the US, I think, for several years. But the ketone salts do increase ketone levels higher than coconut and MCT oil, but it's kind of a temporary thing. The levels will peak at about an hour and then kind of decline over 2 or 3 hours. So it's a temporary bump in ketone levels. But it's, I think many people have reported, there haven't been very many studies yet with the ketone salts, unfortunately, not for cognition yet, although Dr. Cunane, that study has been in progress. So I know that there are studies in progress using the ketone salts. Um, so, I think of it, well, Dr. Cunane and Dr. Veach have all said that the higher your blood ketone level, the more ketones will be taken up in your brain. So there is benefit to trying to increase the level, to as high as possible. And exogenous ketones can help with that, at least temporarily. They can get the level up there. So that's kind of where they came along. And, a lot of people, it's more anecdotal than anything at this point, but they do seem to report, better mental focus. A lot of people report that they feel they have improved memory, they sleep better, less anxiety. And that's something that has been studied in animals, that there seems to be less anxiety, with taking ketones.
What I've heard,
Um,
the anxiety can be like, it's like the proposed mechanisms were the anti-inflammatory effect coupled with like
right. Inflammatory too. That was another thing that's come out. Dr. Veach proposed that they would be anti-inflammatory, and he was able to show that ketones reduce production of what are called reactive oxygen species, that can be harmful, and that they're scavengers. They remove reactive oxygen species and metabolism. So in that sense, anti-inflammatory. But now, other studies have shown several other mechanisms in which ketones reduce inflammation. So this whole, and just think of how many different diseases, including Alzheimer's and other types of brain diseases, that involve inflammation. So reducing inflammation, I mean, different kinds of arthritis. I mean, everything you can think of, every disease, lung diseases, cancers. I mean, all of these things involve inflammation, exaggerated inflammation, and ketones seem to be able to help control it. So, this was another potential benefit of trying to get your ketone levels higher too, using something like ketone salts. And weight loss, they were phenomenal. I remember I got to speak at a conference a few months after the ketones were released. And, there were people that had lost a tremendous amount of body fat, 40, 60 pounds. What was that? Like 20, 30, 40 kilos of body weight, some people had lost in a relatively short period of time. So ketones also seem to suppress appetite, which is interesting, increasing your ketone levels. People on a ketogenic diet find that too. They eat a low carb diet, higher fat diet. The carb cravings tend to go away after a few days, and you're just not nearly as hungry as when you're eating a high carbohydrate diet.
okay.
So there's an effect of appetite suppression. And the other thing that the exogenous ketones reduce blood glucose levels. You can, when I test myself a lot for these products, as each one comes out, I test myself, and I always test my blood glucose, blood ketone level. I have two little monitors set up there, and breath acetone, is something I added about a year ago, when I study these. And I'll test myself for 6 or 8 hours afterwards. A lot of studies only look at 4 hours, what happens at 6 hours, 8 hours. But
And do you follow a ketogenic diet as well?
Yeah, I eat a low carb Mediterranean style diet. It's I tend to be average around 35 grams of carbs a day.
Okay.
So it's low carb, under 50 or 60 grams of carbs. Eating higher fat, people will tend to be in ketosis, so I try to push it lower than that. I'm not carnivore, yeah, at least not yet. So my carbs are mainly vegetables, that I've added to the diet, trying to get fiber. I have a little bit, I'll have like, we're talking literally like an eighth of a cup of whole grain rice or something like
Yeah.
that, not even every day. Um, Sometimes some legumes, things like that are supposed to be beneficial, have certain vitamins and nutrients that other food groups don't have. So I eat a Mediterranean style diet, I would call it, and higher fat. I eat. I have probably at least 3 to 4 tablespoons of a combination, that mixture of coconut and MCT oil, and every day. And I
So,
like butter and olive oil.
I mean, who doesn't, right? But it's just delicious. Then there's one of the pros of being on a ketogenic diet. So
Yeah.
it's been thrown about that uh, there's some people who think that exogenous ketones are or should be classed as a fourth macronutrient. What are your thoughts on that? And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, that's a good question. They do independently. Ketones they do have caloric content. It's just not very high. Um, but I don't know. It's a derivative of fat, so I'm not sure that it's a separate macronutrient per se. Put
okay.
it that way.
But
Um,
on the
you
neuroprotective,
can take it now. You can take beta hydroxybutyrate as an exogenous ketone. It doesn't require fat to do that. So in a sense, there might be something to it. I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
who knows? But I think it's interesting because there's clearly so much power in being in a state of ketosis and a separate conversation of these exogenous ketones.
Yeah.
Um, I've heard that they can increase cerebral blood flow as well.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
and
Ketones, level of ketosis can increase cerebral blood flow, increase flow to the brain by what I've read, I think up to 39%, pretty whopping increase in blood flow. And that is a problem for some people with certain types of dementias and that type of thing. So I think that is a positive benefit, potentially of ketosis, increasing blood flow.
it's noticeable, I think, and I think what is hard to imagine study for you and hard to understand for a layman like
Mhm.
me. All these things seem to be working in the same direction. So you've got lower inflammation, you've got more energy to the brain, you've got
Mhm.
the neuroprotective effects of
Mhm.
MCTs, and
Mhm.
why
Yeah,
people on a ketogenic diet have next to zero C-reactive protein, which is the blood marker for inflammation in the body. And
right.
I guess it's hard for you to pinpoint one thing and study
Yeah,
that.
yeah. A lot of people feel like their aches and pains go away. I mean, they say that, they don't have as people with migraines report, fewer migraines, that they're less intense. I mean, so many different things, that people have reported. And some of these are being studied. Migraines are being studied with ketogenic diets, and they have been already, and with like ketone salts, ketone esters. There are many, many studies now with the ketone ester that are going on right now for all different kinds of disorders, diabetes, type 2 diabetes, especially being one of them. Quite a few studies for that. There's a study that is being conducted by the National Institutes of Aging, which is part of the NIH. I think it's taken time to recruit everybody and get them through the study, but it's 150 people, ages 50 to 70, who have metabolic syndrome. So they have prediabetes, basically. They have insulin resistance, and they're overweight. They tend to have a large waist circumference. They tend to have high blood pressure, but they're studying them with the ketone ester that Dr. Beach, with his ester, and they're giving them a really hefty dose, 25 grams 3 times a day. And actually, my husband, Steve, was the first person with Alzheimer's to take the ketone ester, Dr. Beach's ester, in a pilot study of one person. This happened 2 years after the coconut oil, and it turned him around, from some kind of newer symptoms, a little bit of worsening that he'd had at the time. But they're using that dose that my husband got, which is quite high. For 6 months, they take it 3 times a day. And they're doing every biomarker you can think of in blood, urine, spinal fluid, brain imaging. They're looking at everything, all of these biomarkers related to aging and to diabetes and dementia, cognitive decline. And I'm so looking forward to the outcome of this study. Dr. Veach, he tried so hard. He couldn't get funding from the NIH to do a study with Alzheimer's, which was remarkable. He worked for them his entire career. And then he had this ketone ester, and he couldn't get funding to actually conduct an Alzheimer's study, which was ridiculous. But they're finally doing, it's kind of a pre-Alzheimer's. Can we prevent cognitive decline in people who are very high risk, because of their, metabolic profile?
So
So that they're using ketone as an adjunct to treatments for cancer,
yes.
various types of cancers. Many different kinds of cancers are studying now.
Well, the canon of books on the metabolic theory of cancer, that's been my reading the last, I guess, month and a bit, and it's fascinating, fascinating topic. I just want to double click on the point you made about the study, and A, when is the study? When will we know the results of the study? And B,
Well, it was supposed to have been done in June of this year, but now they've delayed it into 2024. I think somewhere around March or May of 2024, 2025. I'm sorry, that they believe it will be finished, but it does take time to recruit, especially, like a pandemic came along right at the wrong time as they were launching the study. So I think it's taken them quite a while to recruit 150 people and have them continue for 6 months. And, the ketone ester, I'm not sure which product they're using. There are a couple of them out there now, and one tastes better than the other. So I'm not sure whose product they're using. But, some people won't like it and they'll quit pretty quickly, Other people, see benefits. They may feel benefits and then they'll keep it going. So it just takes time, when you're studying that many people. But I just can't wait to see the outcome of this study.
Me too. Me too. If you could conduct any study, so you could wave a magic wand, right, and you can do everything, you've got as much funding as you want, what would you want to know, and what would you want to test?
Wow. This is, Alzheimer's for sure. That would be one, and looking at, I have a collection of anecdotal reports, and people don't report just improvement in memory and cognition. They report improvements, like my husband, in physical symptoms, in their mood, behavioral symptoms. They resume activities that they weren't doing. I mean, there's many different components to Alzheimer's disease, the types of symptoms, but they tend to focus mainly on memory and cognition. So I would want a study that looks more broadly at all of the symptoms, that people experience with Alzheimer's and how they're affected. But I'm a neonatologist, a newborn specialist. I would love to see studies in newborns so there are a couple situations, well, there's several really. I wanted to study them. I just couldn't. I made proposals to try to study this. I couldn't get approval. My director didn't understand this whole idea of ketones as a fuel for the brain. He just didn't get it. So we have, there are babies that are born prematurely, infants of diabetic mothers, many other babies who they're sick and their blood sugar will drop tremendously and to very low levels. They're at risk for a seizure. They're at risk for brain damage. This happens within hours after they're born. And when a baby can't be fed, if a baby can be fed strictly breast milk, no formula, no IV fluid, they will go into ketosis. They go into ketosis fairly quickly. They're actually born in ketosis. Their ketone levels are already elevated, and their levels go up, and babies, they break down their fat. Human babies are fat when they're born, and they'll lose about 10% of their body weight over the first week or so. They're breaking down fat. They're using ketones, fatty acids and ketones to supply fuel to their brain. It takes a while for the milk to come in, mother's milk. I mean, it might just be drops the first day or two, so, and then when they do get breast milk, they're getting medium chain fatty acids in the breast milk. And, therefore making ketones from that too, but when a baby is sick, they don't get feedings, at first. And they're given intravenous fluid that has glucose in it right away. This is what it started. And when a baby has a low blood sugar, if they're an infant of a diabetic mother, the reason their blood sugar gets so low is that they've been chronically seeing a high level of glucose. The baby has. They've got a nice new pancreas that's pumping out insulin like crazy. And that doesn't turn off when they're born, So suddenly they're disconnected from the mother. They're not seeing high blood sugar anymore. It just, that glucose from the mother crosses directly, into the baby's circulation. So that they're cut off from that. And then their blood sugar will drop tremendously. Some of them really seriously low levels. And even giving them like 10% glucose in an IV isn't enough to bring it up. You'll have to go up to 12.5%, 15%, 17%, really high concentrations of glucose just to try to maintain at the edge of normal blood glucose levels, because their pancreas is pumping out so much insulin still. And it could take several weeks for that to subside and kind of normalize, based on their own blood glucose levels. So, that's one situation where ketones could provide alternative fuel to the brain and maybe prevent brain damage. And this happened. This is a constant problem in maternity services, where babies develop hypoglycemia, infants of diabetic mothers, babies who are small for their age, babies who are premature. They're all at risk, for various reasons, for having a low blood glucose and having brain damage as a result if it's not corrected as quickly as possible. So what I wanted to do was a study, very simple study with MCT oil. You can, if they can't eat, you can put a little tube down into their stomach. A lot of premature babies are fed that way, and put down, a relatively small amount of MCT oil, which could be produced to ketones and provide that fuel that the brain needs and potentially prevent brain damage. So this is a study that I wanted to do. Ketone ester, if it were available, would be even better. There were studies back in the 1970s, 1980s, where they were given intravenous ketones, and studying them. And for some reason, I don't know, some people, they retire, they pass away, the research has never continued, so nothing happened with this research, but a ketone ester intravenously would be amazing, to be able to give a baby who's at risk for brain damage. The other situation that's really serious is some babies are born asphyxiated. They'll have a tight cord wrapped around their neck 3 or 4 times, really tight. And it will, as they come down the birth canal, will cut off circulation of their brain, literally. And they can die from it. And the other reasons, why babies are born asphyxiated with a lack of oxygen. And what happens in that situation? The brain first uses up glucose very quickly, but it depletes what are called glucose transporters. These are transporters that transport glucose from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. Those are depleted and they don't regenerate for 3 or 4 days. So brain cells in these areas that are damaged in the brain or that don't have enough oxygen are not taking up glucose normally. They need fuel. And wouldn't it be great if we could supply ketones as fuel to those areas that are impacted, by that intravenously, and intravenous ketone ester? Well, intravenous lipids, when I was doing my training, the lipids that we gave babies was half MCT and half long chain fatty acids. And they discontinued that. We had it in the 1980s and the 1990s. We didn't have it anymore. The fat that we were using for decades was soybean oil. And I think now there's a little bit of a return of adding other oils like omega-3 fatty acids and olive oil and maybe MCT. I know in Europe, I think that they had a product that still had MCTs, but not in the US. Just giving MCT oil intravenously, is a possibility. You wouldn't even have to put it in the stomach. And that's if I could do any study, just think of the lifelong disability that could be saved, in these babies, that are born with this problem. So
Well,
that would be my perfect study as a
I
neonatologist.
look forward to reading the results of it as and when if it ever comes about. That would be a really fascinating study. There seems to be so much resistance on a really big scale, whether it be cancer, whether it be for diabetes, whether it be for cognitive decline and Alzheimer's, on the ketogenic diet. Why do you
Mm,
think that is, and what role do you think ketogenic diet as a whole,
yeah,
including exogenous ketones, have in
yeah,
the fight against Alzheimer's?
yeah, yeah. So I think the big problem is that for decades we've had these dietary guidelines that say we need to eat a low fat diet. And a high fat diet, I mean, the ketogenic diet has a reputation for being unpalatable. They've been saying this for 100 years. I mean, it was first used for epilepsy to treat drug resistant epilepsy in 1921. And it was very effective and still is very effective at sometimes completely eliminating seizures in about 25% of people, who have this problem, or another 50%, it will greatly reduce the number of seizures that they have on a ketogenic diet. But it had a reputation for being unpalatable because it was so high in fat. I don't find a high fat diet unpalatable myself. And I mean, there's so many different recipes. You just have to be creative, and find what you like. And there's different degrees too of a ketogenic diet. Um, Anywhere from no carbs at all, 10%, maybe 20 grams, 30 grams, 40 grams a day. That you can be in ketosis to different degrees depending. The lower carb you eat, the higher fat, the higher your ketone levels get. But there's concern about, for example, there are some people who go on a ketogenic diet, everything will improve. Their body weight will improve, their BMI will improve, their fasting blood glucose, their hemoglobin A1C, will improve, but their LDL cholesterol goes up. And so there's just this long history of believing that a high LDL-C means you're at greater risk of dying from heart disease. And it's just not that simple. I was at a conference, Low Carb USA, in San Diego just last week, about a week and a half ago. And there's an interesting study that's in progress, and there were some preliminary results. And they were looking at people who were on a low carb diet, and these were very fit people, like athletes, athletic type people who are on a very low carbohydrate diet, who then have a very high LDL cholesterol. And they were looking at the amount of atherosclerosis. We're talking on imaging studies that they could document, and the plaques, the number of plaques and the volume of these plaques in arteries. And it just happened that there was another study going on in Miami of another group of very fit people who had lower LDL cholesterol, about 100 milligrams per deciliter lower. I can't remember how many millimoles that is, but they were doing a similar study, same type of imaging. So they had these two different studies, comparing people with really high LDL to really low. And there was like no difference between the atherosclerosis, the volume of plaques and numbers of plaques that they were seeing in the arteries, between these two groups. And, that study, I think the one in Miami had maybe 100 people, and the one in the low carb study was like 80 people, and they're aiming for 100. So that's why it was preliminary, but they had already tested 80 people. And it was very interesting. So there's a lot of discussion about, is it really LDL itself that is a problem? Or, there are some studies out there suggesting that certain types of LDL cholesterol, like oxidized cholesterol, an oxidation of cholesterol can happen with inflammation. There are a lot of foods that contain oxidized, like processed foods that contain oxidized cholesterol. You know, um, Glycation, having a high blood sugar will glycate LDL cholesterol, and make it abnormal and make it inflammatory, so oxidized cholesterol and glycated cholesterol are inflammatory. So there's a lot of discussion about what type of LDL cholesterol are we talking about? Does eating a ketogenic diet increase bad types of cholesterol, or does it maybe even decrease, bad types of cholesterol, even though, the LDL level is higher, what type of LDL are we talking about? So I think that's really an important topic, to think about.
And is that the lipid heart hypothesis?
No, it's, the lipid heart hypothesis is where the idea that having high cholesterol levels causes increased atherosclerosis and a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. But they have never proven that. Like what they've shown. Okay, so I've been investigating these studies. I've read the reports. I mean, we're talking, some of the reports are 200 to 400 pages long of these studies that were conducted throughout the 20th century of the lipid heart hypothesis. So they would compare a standard typical American diet, which they were considering like 40% fat, maybe even 18% of calories as saturated fat, to diets where they would lower cholesterol, dietary cholesterol, greatly lower that. They would lower the total fat intake. They would replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat. So that's what the belief of the lipid heart hypothesis, that if you do those things, reduce cholesterol in the diet, reduce fat in the diet, reduce saturated fat in the diet, and replace it with polyunsaturated fat, that you will have a lower chance of dying from heart disease or having a serious cardiac event. Well, what they showed, for example, low-fat diet, they never did show that it even affected your cholesterol levels. They didn't see, there were some pretty good-sized studies where they compared higher fat, like 40% fat to 30% fat, and they didn't see even a greater reduction in cholesterol levels from doing that. So they never really showed that eating a low-fat diet made a difference. And then they did show, like, if you substitute polyunsaturated fat for saturated fat, it does tend to, at least temporarily, lower serum cholesterol levels on average. This isn't true for every person. Like when they looked at individuals in some of these studies, some people actually had increases in their cholesterol when they had polyunsaturated fat. Some had decreases. On average, it seemed to decrease cholesterol levels when you remove saturated fat and replace it with polyunsaturated fat. But what they never did show was that doing that reduced the risk of dying from heart disease. None of these studies have ever shown that. And most of the studies didn't even show that it reduced your risk of having a heart attack. And then there are autopsy studies. I reviewed quite a few of those, and they didn't show that reducing your cholesterol level had any effect of decreasing atherosclerosis in your arteries, or any effect of reducing adverse effects, heart-related effects, or of reducing deaths, from, by doing this, manipulating the fat this way, on, what they could see in the arteries, the atherosclerosis in the arteries, the plaques in the arteries. They really weren't seeing differences, by doing these dietary maneuvers with fat.
So why have we got it so wrong?
How did they get it so wrong?
Yeah,
Is that what?
why is
Yeah.
the so like dislocated?
It's really, it kind of boggles my mind. One of the big factors that they didn't consider when they were doing all of these studies was that people were eating a lot of trans fat in the U.S. I have to take a sip of water.
Do. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah. So in the 1940s, the mid 1940s in the U.S., the intake of butter and lard, which are natural animal fats, had declined, and the intake of trans fats, margarines, shortenings, had increased, started surpassing the amount of animal fats that were being consumed in the U.S. So people were eating much less butter and lard and much more margarine and shortenings, and these things were loaded with trans fats produced from hydrogenation. It extended the shelf life, but it created 14 unnatural isomers like fatty acids, which are called trans fats. It kind of changed, the structure of the molecule and made it stiffer. And these things have been found to be highly inflammatory, including in arteries. And they were banned in the U.S. As of 2018. They are not allowed to have trans fats in the food above 0.5 grams in a serving of a food, because they found that it did appear to increase the risk of dying from heart disease by eating trans fats. And some of these fats, the margarines and shortenings, could have 35 to 45% of the fat would be these trans fats. So people that were eating, these foods, and a lot of fast foods were processed in these partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, were used in virtually every, I found a report from 1995 that said from the 1960s to the 1980s, virtually all cooking oils in U.S. homes contain trans fats. And,
Wow.
but this was not accounted for when they were doing these dietary fat studies.
So, sorry,
Yeah.
so it's going to be the topic of your next book, right?
Yeah. This is the topic of my next book.
Okay.
They never separately compared animal saturated fat with hydrogenated, separately hydrogenated, man-made oils and fats. They never compared them separately. They always were grouped together as saturated fat when they were doing these studies. Hydrogenated fats, the purpose is to make the fat more saturated, to give it a longer shelf life, because saturated fats are more stable. But it created all these unnatural fats that you don't find in animal fats.
Gosh, wow.
So that was the big flaw, and it's the whole basis of, the dietary guidelines for Americans, which came along in 1980. These studies had been conducted leading up to that. And there were even two studies. Ansel Keys, he's the famous inventor of the idea of the Libet-Hart hypothesis in 1953. He conducted one of these studies, but they were studies where they substituted, in his study, it was corn oil. And there was a study in Australia called the Sydney Diet Heart Study. They were conducted at the same time. They had a similar design. And I believe it was safflower oil that they used in the Sydney study, which I believe it contains almost no omega-3 fatty acid either. That was a big problem. But the people in the study, they had to completely substitute all of the saturated fat in their diet. So they were eliminating all the animal fats and other saturated fats with either corn oil in the one study, safflower oil in the other study. And these were very high in omega-6 fatty acids, both of these oils. And they didn't report these studies when they were finished. I mean, the one that Ansel Keys conducted, it was over 9,000 people. They studied them for 10 years. They didn't report the results of the study. And they even did autopsies. This was one of the autopsy studies, where they had done autopsies on people that died during the study. And they found in both of these studies that using this high, linoleic acid, high omega-6 oil in place of saturated fat increased cardiac mortality, and increased all-cause deaths in both of these studies. And they didn't publish the results.
Why not?
And a group from the NIH, finally, they were able to recover the raw data from these two studies, the results, for the people that were in these studies. And they did report it in 2013 and 2016. They finally reported the results showing that it actually increased mortality,
Oh,
to substitute this relatively large amount of polyunsaturated oil for saturated fat.
wow. Maybe.
And the autopsies were really interesting because they showed they could see evidence of heart attacks, myocardial infarctions. Like the group that got the corn oil, it was something like 41% of them had evidence of having had a heart attack, compared to like 21% in the control group that were just getting a standard diet. So they had double the number of evidence of heart attacks in the group that got the high corn oil diet that Ansel Keys, was using. No wonder they didn't want to publish the results,
No,
but
wow.
it's very unfortunate,
Do you think
because the guidelines for Americans, have they tell us we're supposed to eat, it's the equivalent of like 2 tablespoons of oil every day, and they mean polyunsaturated oil, well, olive oil too, they consider, but they really heavily promote polyunsaturated oils, in the dietary guidelines for Americans to substitute it for saturated fat.
So just quickly for our audience, could you give
Yeah.
some examples of what would be a common source of polyunsaturated fat?
Soybean oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, and then like, let me think. There's several others,
Hmm.
but like olive oil is better. Even a lot of people object to canola. It has a similar profile to olive oil. It would be better than soybean oil or sunflower or safflower oil.
We stick,
um,
we stick to coconut and will be sweet and MCT.
right. Yeah, coconut is a good oil. You still need omega-3 fatty acids are not in coconut or MCT oil. Omega-3 fatty acids are important. And that's where like fish oil, eating fish is the best way to get it. Algae oils, for people that are vegan or vegetarian, fish eat algae. That's where they get their DHA, so algae oils are really good. Krill oil, to get omega-3 fatty acids, which
Okay.
are really important. But
It's nice to give an example for the listener of just like, okay, so what I need
yeah,
to avoid. Dr. Newport, I could talk to you all day. This is so fascinating, and there's so many questions I want to ask. I'd love to
yeah,
ask some quick fire ones, if I may. We always try and do that on the show.
yeah. I have trouble doing quick answers.
Don't worry, it's wonderfully interesting answers. So the first quick fire, which I feel like is probably a bad question to ask as a quick fire, but I really want to ask it anyway. Is there a correlation between people who have 1 copy or 2 copies of ApoE4, or maybe even multiple at-risk people for Alzheimer's because they have genetically inherited the gene that predisposes you to that being ApoE4? How do people with ApoE4 react to ketogenic interventions on cognitive decline and Alzheimer's prevention?
Yeah, so this is actually all over the place. Okay. So the medical food that we first talked about, they seem to show that people who had ApoE4 did not, on average, have improvement. My husband was ApoE4 and he did, but I got to speak with the author, Sam Henderson, the inventor of that idea. And he said, well, about half of the people with ApoE4 actually did have improvement. It's when they averaged the whole group out that they didn't, on average, have improvement. And then, okay, Dr. Cunane, his 65 people study, he didn't see a difference between the ApoE3 and the ApoE4. He was using a CHC10 MCT oil. The Henderson group was using a C8 only MCT oil. Okay, so now there's a new study out where they used coconut oil, and they looked at the ApoE4 and they found that the ApoE4 people were the ones who improved mostly, with taking coconut oil, that they were the ones that improved. And they even had, all of the people who got coconut oil on average, their cholesterol levels went down. The ApoE4 group, their cholesterol levels went down even more for people who are worried about that. So coconut oil didn't increase; it actually decreased, cholesterol levels. And the ApoE4 group were the people who performed the best. So that coconut oil has C6, C8, C10, C12, a lot of C12. C12, lauric acid. There's a study that was conducted in Japan, and they were able to show that C12 potently stimulates ketone production in astrocytes, which are brain cells that nourish the neurons in the brain. So it may have a more direct effect in the brain rather than increasing blood levels. So it's very interesting. So it's all over the place, and it might depend on which strategy you use.
Yeah, I think that's the problem with averages, right? They can be very misleading.
Yeah, they can be very misleading. Yeah, I have a big problem with averages.
I mean, it just seems to trip people up in every field.
It does.
I
I've,
see it.
I've heard more conferences that don't even bother doing this with people who are ApoE4. I'm like, wait a minute, my husband was, and he had a profound response.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Next one is, firstly, I'd like to. I've ordered 2 of your books, but I've started one on the Kindle, and so far it's really, really fascinating, called Simply Keto. And you've written 4 books, 5 on the way. So definitely check out Dr. Newport's books. Yes, Simply
Keto.
Keto. There you can see it on the screen.
Yeah,
And
clearly keto.
which one should people start with? Clearly keto.
Well, it depends on so this book is my 3rd edition of my first book. This is probably the most updated. My husband's story is very extensive. It's probably about 30% of the book. And then there's a chapter that has experiences of a whole lot of other people, some very long term. We're talking people 9, 10 years that they've had improvement, sustained improvement. A man with Parkinson's disease, a man who they thought he had Alzheimer's, and he improved to mild cognitive impairment for the rest of his life. Um, and then another couple, a wife in Japan with early onset Alzheimer's, not in Japan, in Canada, who had a dramatic response. But then a whole lot of other smaller vignettes, of reports that I've gotten from people over the years. But then it does go into the history of Dr. Veach developing the ketone ester, where the idea of using MCTs came from, and how to implement it in the diet. It includes the Mediterranean keto diet, basics about that, how to use the oils, how to use the exogenous ketone supplements, answers a whole lot of questions. This one, Clearly Keto for Healthy Brain Aging and Alzheimer's Prevention, has the introduction. It's got a shorter version of my husband's story, is kind of an introduction. And then I go into a whole lot about the underlying problem of insulin resistance and diabetes, the big problem around the world, and why this is such a big problem, and the brain energy gap. I go into that, explaining that in more detail, and basically how ketones can help improve insulin resistance, provide fuel to the brain, help overcome inflammation, and then a whole lot of detail about the Mediterranean diet, the various components of the diet, the food groups, and the importance of each of the food groups, the importance of getting protein kind of being the number one thing that I push, and the benefits to reducing carbohydrates, and explaining that there's a spectrum of this. People can find a place, a reasonable place that they can adopt this as a lifestyle diet. And then it also goes into the importance of other lifestyle changes. I spend probably 50% of the book talking about other lifestyle changes that could help reduce the risk of dementia, including, exercise, getting adequate sleep, controlling blood pressure, discovering that you have sleep apnea and treating it. It's one of the well-known causes of dementia. Many things to avoid and things to do, in your lifestyle that can help delay or prevent developing dementia. And the experts now believe it could be 30 or 40% of dementias could be completely prevented by making lifestyle changes, diet being number one, exercise being number two. So, and then people who really want to know what goes wrong in the Alzheimer brain want an overview. I've got like an 80-page chapter that took me about 10 months to write, just going through all the changes in the brain, the different pathologies, what happens to each cell type, and many discoveries about what goes wrong in the aging and Alzheimer brain. So it's the books are very different. They cover some of the same territory, but I think they both have value.
Well, I mean, to dive into them in great depth on my upcoming holiday. It's
Yeah.
very top at the moment. I'm really looking forward to that. Are there any other books you would recommend? Any other books that have shaped your worldview that you'd just like to recommend that you really enjoy?
There's one, well, I have another one, but
Yeah,
I've got two more. I'll show you this one, The Complete Book of Ketones.
the ketones, yes.
Yeah, this is one I wrote in 2019. It's more broadly about ketones, and I interview like 16 of the pioneers, the people I talked about, Dr. Veach, Dr. Van Italy, and the rising stars, Dominic D'Agostino, and many others involved in ketone research, and a few dietitians and people who benefited from it and practitioners of it, of that. So that their interviews, and then a lot of history, and basically how to put together a well-formulated ketogenic diet, and monitoring ketones. So it's about all of that. And then I have another book called, this one was written in 2015. That's my review copy. the
Yeah.
low the coconut oil and low carb solution for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And I wanted to say, and this, and this, and this. And my editor said, no, you have to stop your title somewhere, you know. But
Yes.
it's just a simpler version. It's the thinnest book I've written, and it's really goes into eating a whole food, healthy diet and how to incorporate coconut and MCT oil. So those are my books. Okay. And one book that I read not too long ago that I thought was really fascinating, really good, was by Dr. Robert Lustig, Lustig, and it's called Metabolic. And he's an endocrinologist. He studied nutrition as an undergraduate degree, so he's been interested in nutrition much more than many endocrinologists. Very much into medications these days, but he's very much into diet. Treating diabetes with diet and getting away from ultra processed foods. These overly processed foods that are very high in fructose, and these unhealthy fats and all kinds of preservatives and chemicals that are added to them. So that's, really, I really agree with his philosophy in this book, but he really makes a compelling case for all of that. So that's one book that I recommend. And then Cancer as a Metabolic Disease, Dr. Tom Seyfried, very good, comprehensive. He's a geneticist. He's studied cancer as a genetic disease, but and he acknowledges that plays a role in it, but it's what happens to mitochondria that he believes is what happens in cancer cells, that they're defective. They don't process glucose normally. Cancer cells greedily take up glucose. And so, doing a very strict ketogenic diet as an adjunct to treatment could help slow down, and maybe stop the growth of cancers. And now, many studies, and many anecdotal reports, but many studies underway of all different types of cancers with ketogenic diet and other ketogenic therapies, ketone esters that are in progress. So that's another really good one. And there's so many that I could name.
Yeah, they're wonderful recommendations. Just want to add to that for the listener who might be interested is the one called Ravenous by Sam Apple, all about Otto Warburg, who studied the Warburg effect and was, I guess, the leading originator of the metabolic theory of cancer. And I think it pairs well with
With Dr.
Thomas'
Seyfried's
book.
book. Yeah,
I
it
think
does. It explains it in more detail. That is a good book.
It
Yeah.
was, it was fun. I enjoyed reading about the guy. He was very super impressive. But Dr. Newport, as you are an absolute canon of knowledge, and I so enjoyed talking to you today. I could do another 4 hours of this. Is brilliant. Where can we find you and keep up with your work? Where can we find you on the internet? Thanks.
Well, I have a website that I've had up since 2008, that was put out to provide information, and it's grown, since then, but it's called coconutketones.com. So it's spelled COCONUTKETONES. There is no Y in ketones. And I have like a page for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and dementia, It talks about the various strategies. I have a page on the ketogenic diet. It's a diet that was developed by Dr. Eric Westman at Duke University for people with type 2 diabetes that can completely reverse. It can get their blood glucose, hemoglobin A1C completely back to normal by following this diet. He's helped over 4,000 people with type 2 diabetes. And I modified it a bit for people that want to incorporate some carbs, so I have, at the bottom of this, I mean, you can print it out. Everything, you can print out everything for free, from my website. Um, so that's, I think people will find that interesting. And then links to my books and that suggested other reading, and that type of thing, was available. A lot of information about ketone supplements and various discussions about various ones and that type of thing.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Will, thank you so much for being so generous and coming on. I've had absolute blast, and I have no doubt the listener will have so many takeaways for this. And yeah, thank you so much. Really been a privilege.
Thank you for inviting me, Ben. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I just thank you for helping me get this message out to many more people.